how should you structure and organize your practice? What do you practice during your time? Welcome to the channel. My name is David, and if you're new here on this channel, I love breaking down everything that is Spanish guitar for the absolute beginner who wants to learn how to play this style. How should you structure and organize your practice? What do you practice during your time? Now, it all depends on how much time you have, and again, and what phase you are of your guitar journey. At the very beginning, as an absolute beginner, you're gonna have less things to practice. You're just not gonna know as much. You're gonna have a few exercises, maybe a song excerpt. You're only gonna know a couple chords, and it's gonna be a lot easier to fit in almost everything that you know into that short amount of practice. The issue is, the more you keep progressing, the more things you learn, that's when it gets a little bit more trickier, and you have to be a little bit more strategic and start deciding how to break up your practice session. So generally speaking, each practice session can involve three main elements: a warm-up, actual practice, and lastly, performance practice.
Roughly about 10 to 15% of my practice is my warm-up, right? About 10 to 15% is performance practice, right? And the rest of it, roughly 70-ish%, is my strategic practice, where I'm really focusing on what I mentioned earlier: succeeding enough, correct repetitions, really being deliberate about, fixing things, having a lot of goals in mind.
Now, a warm-up can vary depending on what stage of your journey you are and how long you're practicing. If you're only practicing for 15 minutes and you're an absolute beginner, I think the main thing is just to be careful that you're not putting too much tension into your playing. And your warm-up can involve something as simple as just taking a minute or two just to stretch out your fingers, get a little dynamic stretching by just getting some motion in, and being very light on your approach for that first couple minutes. Once you get into longer practice sessions, we're talking about 45 minutes to 60 minutes or longer, then that's when you'll have a little bit more time to dedicate to actually warming up your hands with different techniques once you're actually playing different techniques and you already know them. But as an absolute beginner, again, your knowledge is going to be limited, so it's just a question of getting some blood into those fingers and getting a little dynamic motion into them before you start playing. Now, number two would be actual practice. Now, it might seem like common sense practice, but not everybody knows exactly what practice is. Practice means you're actually practicing exercises, actually focusing in on all the things that you need to have correctly, repeating things, making sure that you correct things, not just playing through things.
When people say practicing, I could sit and play for 3 hours and achieve nothing.
Right.
Like, you're just playing. Or I could sit down for an hour and actually practice what I'm doing, meaning like break the piece apart, practice a small section at a slow tempo, listen to what's coming out of my guitar. If it's something's buzzing, maybe fix it. If I'm using the wrong fingers, like actually practicing, right? So what they do is they just play over and over and over again. They'll make the same mistake over and over again. They enjoy the process, but then they're surprised why they're not improving, or like they can't play anything more difficult. It's just because they're not actually practicing.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I was curious about. It's funny that you mentioned that.
Lack of metronome use.
Yeah.
No one uses the metronome. Like if I don't make them, no slow practicing. They just literally play the piece wherever tempo they can. If something's messy, they attribute it to the fact that like, oh, well, I'm not a professional, so whatever. But no, like if that piece is not that hard, that's not a good excuse. You could absolutely do it well if you actually practice to do it well. Practicing is work. It's not fun. Mm-hmm. Playing is fun. Mm-hmm. So if you're having too much fun, unless like you really, really enjoy like that tedious repeating, which can be fun, unless that's what's happening, you probably are not really practicing, because it can be annoying, like you're doing the same thing 10 times in a row, 20 times in a row, slowly to a ticker. But if you trust that process, you do that for a couple of weeks, and then 3 weeks down the road, you play through the piece. It's going to sound much better than that first time.
Mm-hmm. So between elements number 2 and 3, practice and performance practice, make sure you don't get them confused. Actual practice involves practicing your techniques, going through song excerpts, and making sure that we're focusing in on all the key points to correct something or perform something optimally. And if we make mistakes, repeating it. However many times you need to repeat to get your successful results and make some progress in each session. That's how we practice. Performance practice, on the other hand, is actually just playing from point A to point B without stopping, even if we make mistakes, going all the way through as if we are performing. which is also necessary, but I will say that you don't always need to use performance practice as part of your practice sessions. It could be something that you only do a couple times a week, and you only save it for when you're actually feeling a little bit more ready to practice through a piece or maybe just a longer song excerpt. As an absolute beginner, you're probably not going to need to use performance practice as much from the very start because you're not going to have that much material or full pieces. But once you do have your first beginner pieces and you've already practiced them for several days, for a couple of weeks, you're feeling confident with them, you've really focused on the actual practice, then it's nice to try to challenge yourself and do a performance practice and see how you can make it from point A to point B, from the beginning to end. Even if you have a mistake, just getting through it. And that's very important because once we start performing for people, it's not practice anymore. And we want to make sure that we practice the art of performing before we practice for people. So we want to make sure that we practice the art and the science behind performing before we actually perform for people, which is a whole different ballgame. And that's when our nerves will eat us up. And that's why we need to actually practice performing. Now, Diego Alonso had some interesting things to say about performance practice and how he personally incorporates it into his weekly practice routine. So check it out.
Not performing enough and not including that, in my opinion, as part of the practice session can cause problems. Because then when you go to perform, you're not going to be used to that. You're not going to be used to playing the music top to bottom without stopping.
Mm-hmm.
And if we sit and practice all the time and correct, we get used to stopping at an error, correcting it, repeating it, going to the next one, correcting, repeating, then maybe looping it and doing this kind of thing. But that's not what performance is, right? We don't want to get it right on the first time. What I had started to do in my own practice was after my warm-up, now this is, again, not for total beginners, but at an intermediate level, after my warm-up, I would play whatever I was working on just once. If it was just a line of music that I was working on that I had worked on the previous day, just once, top to bottom, and then fine, then I would work on my corrections and then I would end my practice with another performance run.
So as you can see, the length of your practice sessions and how you can structure them isn't a one-size-fits-all. So while I'm not able to give you a specific answer since I'm not exactly sure who's behind the screen, I hope I gave you enough information and insights so that you can decipher what exactly is an optimal amount of time and how to structure your own personal practice sessions.